August 15th, 1945, began the journey to forever of why Korea will never remain a whole nation, but North and South Korea governed by different bodies. The journey of how and why Korea was split into North and South Korea doesn't just happen within the four walls of the National Assembly. It was war before the Allies. It was a journey that will live forever. After the war ended across Asia, the Empire of Japan, once master of the Pacific, surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. In the streets of Seoul, Pyongyang, and countless small towns scattered across the Korean peninsula, people poured out of their homes in tears, in song, in disbelief. 35 years of colonial subjugation had ended. Across cities, church bells rang, and old Korean flags hidden for decades were raised once more. For the first time in a generation, the air was filled not with orders barked in Japanese, but with the native tongue of a liberated people. Yet that moment of joy, brief, electric, and unifying, was not the dawn of independence that Koreans had imagined. Freedom had returned, but unity had not. The story that began in jubilation would soon darken into one of division, suspicion, and betrayal. This is where the tragedy of Korea's split truly began. In the days immediately following liberation, when hope was still young and unspoiled, and when decisions made half a world away set the stage for a wound that has never healed. In the summer of 1945, as Japan's empire collapsed under the weight of defeat, the Allied powers faced a question that seemed simple but would define the century. What would become of Korea? Since 1910, Korea had been a colony of Japan, its emperor dethroned, its language suppressed, its people forced to adopt Japanese names and customs. The Japanese had industrialized parts of the peninsula but exploited its labor and resources to feed imperial ambitions. Millions of Koreans had been conscripted into Japan's war machine, some sent to mines, factories, or even the front lines. Thousands of women were coerced into military brothels as so-called comfort women. When Japan finally surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Korean people believed the world would recognize their suffering and restore their sovereignty. They expected a single, independent nation to rise from the ruins. But history is rarely shaped by those who endure it. As Tokyo's formal surrender approached, the Allied command was unprepared for Korea's sudden liberation. No Allied army had marched into Seoul, and no Korean government in exile had the power to step in. Instead, decisions were made far from the peninsula, in the corridors of Washington and Moscow. On the night of August 10, 1945, just days before Japan's formal surrender, two relatively junior American officers, Colonel Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles Bonesteel, were summoned to the Pentagon and given an urgent assignment: determine how the Japanese forces in Korea should surrender to Allied control. They were not diplomats, nor were they experts on Korea. Rusk would later admit that neither of them knew much about the peninsula beyond what a National Geographic map could tell them. With little time and less information, they took a pencil and drew a line roughly halfway down the map, choosing the 38th parallel as the dividing point. Their reasoning was pragmatic, not political. The line would place Seoul, the capital, under American control, while leaving the northern part of the country to Soviet forces already advancing southward from Manchuria. They assumed the division was temporary, a military convenience to accept Japan's surrender in an orderly fashion. But that line, drawn hastily in the quiet of an office, would soon become one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. No Korean was consulted. Not a single voice from Seoul, Pyongyang, or the countless resistance groups that had fought against Japan was heard. The peninsula's fate was sealed by men who had never set foot on it. The next morning, the United States presented the proposal to the Soviet Union. To Washington's surprise, the Soviets agreed. Within weeks, Soviet troops entered Pyongyang, while American forces prepared to land in the south. By early September, the partition had become reality. In the north, Soviet forces under General Taranishnikov moved swiftly to establish control. They met little resistance. Many Koreans initially welcomed them, mistaking them for liberators who would ensure national independence. The Soviets quickly disarmed the remaining Japanese units, secured administrative buildings, and began forming local people's committees. In these committees lay the seeds of a new political order. Guided by Soviet advisors, they promoted land reform, confiscated Japanese and collaborationist estates, and distributed them among peasants. Factories were nationalized, labor unions organized, and a new leadership class began to emerge, one shaped not by centuries of Korean aristocracy, but by revolutionary ideology. Among those returning to the north was a young guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung. Having fought the Japanese as part of Soviet-backed partisan units in Manchuria, Kim had gained both military experience and the trust of Moscow. The Soviets saw in him a loyal, malleable leader, someone who could embody Korean nationalism while aligning with communist ideals. To many Koreans, Kim appeared as a war hero, a symbol of resistance. By the end of 1945, his rise had begun, quietly and inexorably. South of the 38th parallel, American troops landed at Incheon on September 8, 1945, under the command of Lieutenant General John R. Hodge. Unlike the Soviets, the Americans were greeted not with enthusiasm, but with confusion and resentment. Korean independence activists had already begun forming local governments and assemblies, expecting to govern their liberated homeland. Yet Hodge was instructed to treat Korea as an occupied enemy territory until a formal government could be established. The United States Army military government in Korea, known as Yusamjik, became the de facto authority in the South. Almost immediately, contradictions appeared. American officials, unfamiliar with Korean society and language, struggled to communicate or administer effectively. Lacking trained interpreters, they often relied on Japanese bureaucrats who had served under the colonial administration, the very symbols of oppression the Korean people despised. To maintain order, Yusamjik re-employed these officials, alienating many Koreans who viewed the move as a betrayal of liberation. Meanwhile, the South's political landscape fractured. Dozens of parties, committees, and independence groups emerged, representing every ideology from far-left socialism to conservative nationalism. Among them was Syngman Rhee, an elderly statesman who had lived in exile for decades and lobbied for Korean independence in the United States. Charismatic and fiercely anti-communist, Rhee quickly became Washington's favored figure. Yet within Korea, his return fueled division rather than unity. Left-leaning organizations, many with roots in the resistance movement, clashed with conservative factions supported by the U.S. As 1945 gave way to 1946, the dream of a unified Korea began to unravel. The 38th parallel, originally just a line of surrender, hardened into a border. Families found themselves separated overnight. Merchants could no longer trade freely. Farmers were cut off from their markets. The Soviets introduced their own administrative structures, currency, and police forces in the north, while the Americans did the same in the south. The peninsula's arteries, its railways, roads, and rivers became veins cut in two. In Seoul, frustration turned to anger. Workers and students organized demonstrations demanding immediate independence and an end to military rule. Strikes erupted across the country, particularly in the southern provinces. One of the largest took place in September 1946, when tens of thousands of railway workers walked off the job, spreading a wave of protests that the American authorities crushed with violence. Hundreds were arrested, dozens were killed. To the U.S. command, the strikes were the work of communist agitators directed from the north. To the protesters, they were cries for dignity after decades of foreign domination, first by Japan, now by new masters in different uniforms. In the north, land reforms transformed society. The Soviet administration confiscated large estates, redistributed them to peasants, and abolished tenant farming. For the first time, poor farmers owned the soil they tilled. While these reforms won popular support, they also dismantled the traditional elite, sending landlords and businessmen fleeing south. The influx of refugees further destabilized Seoul, deepening economic hardship and political chaos. By late 1946, two different Koreas were already taking shape. The North moved towards socialism, guided by Soviet doctrine and enforced by new security forces. The South remained under American supervision, where anti-communism became state policy. Both claimed legitimacy. Neither represented the whole peninsula. The division, though not yet formalized, was already a living reality. Internationally, the divide reflected a larger transformation. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had dissolved into suspicion and rivalry. The world was entering the Cold War, and Korea, strategically placed between China, Japan, and the Soviet Far East, became one of its earliest battlegrounds. Each superpower saw the peninsula not as a nation recovering from occupation, but as a piece on a global chessboard. For ordinary Koreans, the promises of liberation had turned hollow. In villages, people whispered about missing family members now trapped on the other side of the line. In cities, students debated ideology while food shortages worsened. The peninsula that had endured centuries as one people was now split by decisions made in foreign capitals. By the end of 1947, the illusion of temporary occupation had faded. Two separate administrations operated under two foreign powers. The dream of national unity, the dream that had carried resistance fighters through decades of Japanese rule, was slipping away. As night fell on the last months of 1945 and the first dawns of 1946, the bells that had once rung in celebration now tolled for uncertainty. Korea was free, yet not free. Independent, yet not whole. In the words of one observer, the Japanese left, but their shadow remained split in two by rival suns. Thus began the strange new era of liberation without freedom. A land that had waited generations for independence found itself a pawn in the designs of empire once more. The line drawn by Rusk and Bone Steel was still invisible to the naked eye, but it already ran deep through the heart of a nation. And in that invisible line lay the origins of a division that would shape not only the destiny of Korea, but the course of the world itself. By the autumn of 1945, Korea stood between two worlds. The empire that had ruled it for 35 years had vanished almost overnight, and in its place, two new powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had arrived as liberators. Yet liberation, in practice, meant occupation. Each half of the peninsula began to fall under the influence of a different ideology, shaped not by the will of the Korean people, but by the contrasting visions of Washington and Moscow. The story that followed was not simply a tale of political division, but of two rival experiments, each claiming to represent the rebirth of Korea from the ruins of empire. In the north, the Red Army moved swiftly. By late August 1945, Soviet troops had entered Pyongyang, greeted with cautious curiosity by Koreans who had long endured Japanese rule. Many expected them to be temporary overseers who would help restore independence. Instead, the Soviets began building something far more structured, a socialist administration aligned with Moscow's model. Their priority was stability, and to achieve it, they turned to local Korean communists and guerrilla fighters who had proven loyal to the cause. The Soviet Civil Administration, established in October 1945, began reconstructing every institution from the ground up. Japanese officials were dismissed or arrested. Korean collaborators were purged. Committees sprang up across towns and villages, so-called people's committees, local governing bodies meant to represent the will of the people. Yet behind this democratic facade lay firm Soviet guidance. The The Soviet command supervised all major appointments, ensuring that only politically reliable figures held authority. Among those who rose during this time was a young man named Kim Il-sung. Born in 1912 near Pyongyang, Kim had fled Japanese rule in his youth and spent much of the 1930s fighting as a guerrilla in Manchuria. When the Soviets entered Korea, they found in him a disciplined, charismatic fighter who spoke their language and carried the credentials of a resistance hero. He was barely in his early 30s, but Moscow saw in him a leader who could unite Korea's left under Soviet supervision. In October 1945, the Soviets presented Kim Il-sung publicly in Pyongyang, praising him as a national hero and a symbol of liberation. It was a carefully orchestrated moment, marking the beginning of a political dynasty that would shape the northern half of the peninsula for generations. Land reform was one of the first and most dramatic measures enacted in the north. Centuries of feudal ownership had left much of Korea's farmland in the hands of landlords and Japanese colonists. In March 1946, the Soviet-backed authorities confiscated these estates and redistributed them to tenant farmers without compensation. This act transformed the countryside overnight. Hundreds of thousands of peasants, once bound to landlords, suddenly owned the land they worked. To many in the north, it felt like a real liberation, tangible, material, and immediate. It secured the new regime's popular base, binding the rural masses to the communist government that claimed to represent them. Factories, banks, and major industries were nationalized under Soviet supervision. Workers were encouraged to form trade unions. Literacy campaigns spread through the countryside. The Soviet Union supplied advisors, technical experts, and political officers, embedding its ideology deeply into the structure of governance. Soviet officers trained local militias and police, ensuring that power remained centralized and obedient to the communist hierarchy taking shape in Pyongyang. While the North underwent rapid transformation, the South was entering a period of confusion, unrest, and contradiction. The United States Army military government in Korea, known as Uzamjik, landed at Incheon on September 8, 1945, and established its headquarters in Seoul. Led by Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, the Americans faced a vastly different environment than their Soviet counterparts. They entered a land already organized by Koreans themselves. Before American troops had even arrived, a group of Korean nationalists led by Ryu Woon-hyung had proclaimed the formation of the People's Republic of Korea, PRK, an interim government meant to represent all Koreans. The PRK had established local committees across the country, coordinating food distribution, law enforcement, and the restoration of order. But when General Hodge took control, he refused to recognize this government, viewing it as communist-influenced and illegitimate. Instead, he ordered the dissolution of the People's Committees and re-established authority under U.S. command. The Americans, lacking linguistic knowledge and cultural understanding, relied heavily on Japanese administrative structures and personnel left over from the colonial government. Many Koreans saw this as a betrayal. They had endured decades of Japanese oppression, and now, the same bureaucrats and police officers who had enforced colonial rule were reinstated under American oversight. This created immediate resentment and fueled widespread protests. Uzamjik's goal was to stabilize the economy and prevent communist influence, but its actions often had the opposite effect. The government banned strikes and censored leftist publications. American officials viewed Korean politics through the emerging lens of the Cold War, seeing local communists not as patriots or reformers, but as agents of Moscow. In response, left-wing groups across the South organized mass demonstrations. Peasants demanded land redistribution, workers called for better wages, and students protested the continued presence of former Japanese collaborators in power. In September 1946, a massive strike wave began in the southern provinces, starting with railway workers in Busan and spreading rapidly to factories, mines, and docks. The movement soon evolved into a nationwide uprising, with more than 250,000 participants. Uzamjuk responded with force, using military police to crush the strikes and imprison their leaders. Violence flared across the country. In Taegu, protesters clashed with police, resulting in dozens of deaths. This event, known as the Autumn Uprising of 1946, marked a turning point. It exposed the widening gulf between the southern population and the American military government. At the same time, Uzamjuk began to nurture conservative, anti-communist political leaders as a counterweight to the left. One of these was Syngman Rhee, an aging nationalist who had spent decades in exile lobbying for Korean independence. Educated in the United States and fluent in English, Rhee was seen as a reliable ally who understood Western ideals. His staunch opposition to communism made him a natural partner for American policymakers seeking to contain Soviet influence. Under Rhee's rising influence, the South began to align more firmly with the capitalist bloc. Economic reforms favored large landowners and industrialists. Labor unions were suppressed, and leftist organizations were outlawed. The U.S. sought to build a functioning government modeled after liberal democracy, but the structure remained authoritarian, propped up by martial control and censorship. Meanwhile, the division of the peninsula was deepening. The 38th parallel, originally intended as a temporary military boundary, became increasingly fortified. Movement across the line was restricted. Families found themselves separated. Merchants and officials could no longer cross freely. The ideological contrast between the North and South became visible in everyday life. Land ownership, political meetings, and even education began to follow opposite paths. To many Koreans, the growing split felt unnatural, even tragic. For centuries, the peninsula had shared one language, one culture, and one historical memory. Now, within a single year, it was being molded into two competing societies. Yet both the U.S. and the Soviet Union claimed their presence was only provisional, meant to prepare Korea for independence. In truth, neither side trusted the other to guide that process. In the countryside, rumors spread of reunification committees, secret meetings, and underground networks seeking to bridge the divide. But these efforts were short-lived. The atmosphere of suspicion intensified. U.S. intelligence began arresting suspected communist organizers, while in the North, the Soviets purged those deemed politically unreliable or insufficiently loyal to Kim Il-sung's leadership. By 1947, the contrasting systems were firmly entrenched. In the North, Kim's government consolidated control through the Provisional People's Committee of North Korea. Land reform was completed, industries nationalized, and political opposition silenced. Soviet advisors oversaw the creation of a new security apparatus modeled on the NKVD, ensuring that dissent would be swiftly crushed. Propaganda celebrated Kim Il-sung as the great leader who had liberated Korea from Japanese oppression and was now defending it from imperialist threats. In the South, Uzamjuk struggled to maintain legitimacy. Economic hardship persisted, inflation soared, and food shortages were rampant. The disillusionment of the working class deepened, while right-wing youth groups attacked leftist gatherings with impunity. The Americans viewed these disturbances through the prism of the global struggle between democracy and communism, rarely grasping that for many Koreans, the central issue was not ideology but sovereignty. They wanted self-rule, not another foreign power deciding their fate. By late 1947, both governments, North and South, had drifted beyond reconciliation. The dream of a unified Korea, free and independent, was slipping away. The North had found stability through revolutionary change, the South through foreign-backed order. Each claimed legitimacy as the sole representative of the Korean nation. Across the 38th parallel, two contrasting symbols began to rise. In Pyongyang, red banners fluttered above the people's committees, promising equality and revolution. In Seoul, the American flag flew beside the taegukgi, symbolizing liberty and alliance. But beneath the banners, ordinary Koreans continued to live in uncertainty, unsure whether the freedom they had waited decades for would ever truly arrive. What had begun as an accidental line on a map was transforming into a boundary of ideology and power. The North, forged in the crucible of Soviet planning, was marching towards socialism under Kim Il-sung's rising authority. The South, under American supervision, was struggling to balance order and democracy, all while facing internal rebellion and social chaos. Two occupations, two visions, each claiming to secure Korea's future, yet each sowing the seeds of lasting division. And while diplomats in Washington and Moscow debated the next step for Korea, the people themselves could only watch as their nation, liberated but not free, was being rewritten into two conflicting realities. In those uncertain years between 1945 and 1947, the shape of modern Korea was cast. The choices made in those days, the land reforms, the purges, the alliances, and the suppression of dissent would harden into the political DNA of two states destined to face each other across a frozen border. Freedom had come, but unity was lost. The peninsula that had once dreamed of a single dawn now stood divided by the ambitions of strangers, each believing they were building a better Korea. Yet for the millions who lived through those years, the promise of liberation had turned into a new kind of captivity, one not of empire, but of ideology. By the closing months of 1945, hope still lingered across Korea that the division at the 38th parallel was a temporary measure. Many Koreans believed that the great powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and Britain would soon agree on a process to restore their long-denied independence. Yet as months turned into years, the dream of unity collided with the growing reality of a world splitting in two. In the shadow of the emerging Cold War, Korea's fate was becoming a test of whether former colonies could truly be free in an age of rival empires. At the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers in December 1945, representatives of the Allied powers gathered to decide the future of territories liberated from Japan. Among the issues discussed was the Korean question. The conference concluded that Korea would not receive immediate independence, but would instead be placed under a temporary four-power trusteeship for up to 5 years. During that period, the Soviet Union, the United States, China, and Britain would cooperate to guide Korea towards self-government. On paper, it seemed a rational compromise. Korea, lacking stable institutions after decades of Japanese rule, would receive the support of the victorious powers before becoming fully independent. But to the Korean people, the word trusteeship sounded like a cruel echo of colonial rule. The ink had barely dried on Japan's surrender when newspapers in Seoul published the conference results. Within hours, outrage spread through the streets. Students, workers, and intellectuals denounced the decision as another betrayal of their right to self-determination. They had fought, suffered, and died for independence, not for another period of foreign supervision. Demonstrations erupted across major cities. Protesters marched under banners demanding immediate independence and no more foreign rule. Ironically, the opposition to trusteeship divided Korea even further. In the North, under Soviet influence, left-wing groups cautiously supported the plan, arguing that it could lead to the establishment of a unified, socialist-leaning Korea under international protection. Kim Il-sung and the emerging North Korean leadership portrayed trusteeship as a necessary step to ensure that imperialist forces did not regain control. In the South, right-wing nationalists led by Syngman Rhee rejected it entirely, claiming that any foreign oversight, especially Soviet involvement, was an insult to the Korean nation. The result was a profound ideological fracture that mirrored the global confrontation taking shape between Washington and Moscow. In early 1946, as protests intensified, the United States and the Soviet Union established the Joint Commission to coordinate their policies in Korea and to prepare the ground for a unified provisional government. The commission convened in Seoul in March of that year, bringing together American and Soviet diplomats, interpreters, and military advisors. Its mission was to consult with Korean political parties and social organizations to create a government acceptable to both sides. Yet almost immediately, the talks descended into a stalemate. The Americans insisted that the commission should consult with all political parties and organizations across Korea, regardless of their ideological leanings. The Soviets countered that only those groups supporting the Moscow trusteeship decision should be allowed to participate. Each side accused the other of trying to manipulate the process for its own ends. For the Soviet delegation, American officials were protecting reactionary forces, ex-collaborators, and right-wing extremists. For the Americans, the Soviets were building a puppet regime dominated by communists. The Joint Commission adjourned without progress, and the divide on the ground deepened. In the north, Kim Il-sung's Provisional People's Committee of North Korea consolidated control, enacting reforms and building the foundation of a socialist state. In the south, political life fragmented into competing factions: nationalists, communists, moderates, and religious groups, all vying for influence under the supervision of the U.S. military government. The failure of the Joint Commission marked a decisive turning point. By mid-1946, it was increasingly clear that the two occupying powers were shaping their zones not for reunification, but for endurance. The Soviet Union's presence in the north brought order and rapid change under strict central control. The U.S. occupation in the south, however, became entangled in chaos, economic instability, social unrest, and growing political polarization. As 1946 drew to a close, uprisings continued in southern Korea. The memory of the Daegu protests, where dozens had been killed during clashes with police, still haunted the population. Farmers in the countryside were angry at the slow pace of reform and the persistence of land inequality. In contrast, across the 38th parallel, land redistribution had already transformed the North's rural landscape. To the average Korean peasant, the North seemed to embody the kind of revolutionary justice they had long dreamed of, while the South appeared trapped in old hierarchies. In Washington, policymakers began to see Korea not as a distant Asian issue, but as a front line in the growing Cold War. The Soviet Union had tightened its hold over Eastern Europe, and communist movements were gaining influence in China. American officials feared that losing Korea to communism would destabilize all of Asia. Their response was to strengthen conservative forces in the South, especially around Syngman Rhee. The old exile had returned to Korea in 1945 with the backing of U.S. authorities, and his fierce anti-communist rhetoric resonated with American fears. Rhee quickly positioned himself as the leading voice for an independent, Western-aligned Korea. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin and his advisors viewed the American presence on the peninsula with equal suspicion. They believed that Washington was preparing to use the South as a military base for encirclement. Soviet policy shifted accordingly. The goal was to ensure that a friendly, communist Korea would exist on their border. Kim Il-sung's rise became central to this strategy. Under Soviet tutelage, he organized the North Korean Workers' Party, uniting various leftist groups under his leadership. His speeches invoked independence, land reform, and resistance to foreign domination rhetoric that appealed deeply to a population still scarred by colonialism. By 1947, the political deadlock had become irreversible. The Joint Commission reconvened in May, but once again, disputes over which Korean organizations could participate doomed the discussions. The Americans accused the Soviets of blocking moderate voices, while the Soviets accused the Americans of sabotaging unity. Each side's intransigence mirrored the deepening mistrust that had already divided Europe into opposing blocs. Korea had become another casualty of the global ideological struggle. Frustrated, the United States decided to take the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In September 1947, Washington appealed to the UN General Assembly to supervise free elections throughout Korea to establish a legitimate, unified government. The proposal was endorsed, and the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea, UNTOK, was created to oversee the process. However, the Soviet Union and the Northern authorities refused to allow UN representatives to cross the 38th parallel, dismissing the plan as a violation of the original agreements. Thus, the elections that followed could only take place in the South. The UN's involvement, which was meant to unify Korea, instead solidified the separation. In the eyes of many Koreans, the United Nations, intended as a symbol of international justice, had become another instrument of the Cold War, enforcing a division that had never been approved by the Korean people themselves. In the streets of Seoul and Pyongyang, propaganda intensified. In the north, posters showed peasants breaking their chains under red banners, declaring that true liberation lay in socialism. In the south, pamphlets depicted the North as enslaved by communism, warning that only democratic capitalism could guarantee freedom. Both sides invoked nationalism, both spoke of unity, and both accused the other of betraying Korea's destiny. Yet behind these slogans lay human suffering. Families were split by the 38th parallel, unable to visit or even send letters across the border. Merchants who once traded freely between Seoul and Pyongyang were now cut off from their livelihoods. Trains that once crossed the peninsula in a single day now stopped abruptly at military checkpoints. The division, still not formally recognized, was already becoming real in the lives of millions. The world beyond Korea watched with limited attention. Europe dominated the headlines. Berlin was being divided, the Marshall Plan was underway, and the Iron Curtain had descended. Few in the West grasped that a similar curtain was falling across Asia, and that Korea would soon become the stage for a new kind of war. As 1947 ended, optimism had vanished. The promise of the Moscow Conference had been replaced by frustration and mistrust. The line that had once been drawn for military convenience was now the border of two rival ideologies. The Soviet Union had its Korea in the north, disciplined and revolutionary. The United States had its Korea in the south, unstable but loyal. The failure of unity was complete. What had begun as a question of administration had become a question of identity. The Korean people, who had endured occupation and dreamed of nationhood, found themselves trapped between global powers that viewed their homeland not as a nation reborn, but as a pawn in a larger game. When the United Nations prepared to hold elections in 1948, it did so with the assumption that legitimacy could be manufactured by process. But for those who lived through the years between 1945 and 1947, legitimacy was not found in decrees or commissions. It was rooted in the unfulfilled hope that Korea would stand as one. That hope was slipping away, carried off by the cold winds of geopolitics, as the peninsula's fate moved beyond the reach of its own people. By then, the seeds of permanent division had already taken root. The Americans and Soviets would never again meet in cooperation over Korea. The next time they faced each other there, it would be through the guns of their proxies. The failure of unity was not simply the end of diplomacy. It was the quiet beginning of a conflict that would soon explode into one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. In spring 1948, the Korean Peninsula stood at a crossroads, a nation uncertain of its own future, split by the currents of two superpowers that no longer trusted one another. The promise of liberation that had once stirred hearts in 1945 now felt hollow, drowned out by speeches, protests, and political schemes. The joint commissions had failed, unity had faded, and both Moscow and Washington had grown impatient. It was now clear there would be no one Korea. There would be two. In the South, under American military rule, the U.S. authorities and their appointed leader, Syngman Rhee, were pushing for elections to legitimize a new government. The Americans presented it as democracy in action, the Korean people choosing their own destiny. But in truth, the process was deeply contested. Many Koreans saw these elections not as freedom, but as the final betrayal of unity. On May 10, 1948, elections were held in the Southern Zone under the supervision of the newly formed United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea, UNTOK. The North, under Soviet influence, refused to recognize the legitimacy of UN oversight, and the Soviets barred international inspectors from crossing the 38th parallel. The North's propaganda machine denounced the vote as a puppet act orchestrated by Washington to install a regime subservient to American interests. In Seoul, however, despite boycotts and violence, ballots were cast. Voters walked through ruined streets, still bearing the scars of the Pacific War. Korean police, many of them former collaborators from the Japanese colonial administration, guarded the polls. The symbolism was bitter. The same uniforms that once enforced Japan's will were now protecting an election proclaimed to be free. The results brought Syngman Rhee to prominence. For decades, Rhee had lived in exile as a Christian nationalist, Western-educated, and fiercely anti-communist. To the Americans, he was the perfect ally. Fluent in English, politically reliable, and determined to keep the peninsula from falling into the Soviet orbit. But to many Koreans, he was a divisive figure, a man detached from the struggles of ordinary people who had endured Japanese rule. By August 15, 1948, the third anniversary of Korea's liberation, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was formally proclaimed in Seoul. Church bells rang again, fireworks lit the sky, and the crowds cheered the rebirth of a nation. Yet beneath the celebration lay the ache of loss because that same day, the North declared the South's government null and void. In Pyongyang, the Soviets and their chosen leader, Kim Il-sung, prepared their own announcement. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was proclaimed on September 9, 1948, less than a month later. Kim Il-sung, young and confident, stood before the gathered delegates and promised a new era, one built on self-reliance, revolutionary zeal, and freedom from imperial influence. To his people, he was introduced not merely as a politician, but as a hero of liberation, the guerrilla who had fought the Japanese and now stood as the embodiment of a new Korea. Two governments now existed, each claiming to be the rightful ruler of the entire peninsula. Each declared its mission to reunify the homeland, but through utterly different means. In Seoul, Rhee swore to liberate the North from communism. In Pyongyang, Kim promised to overthrow the Southern puppet regime. The peninsula's division had begun as an arbitrary military line, a temporary boundary drawn in haste by two American officers with a map and a pencil. But in 1948, that line hardened into ideology. The 38th parallel became a political wall, enforced by armies, barbed wire, and incompatible dreams. In the South, Syngman Rhee's administration was plagued by dissent from the very beginning. Large segments of the population, especially peasants, leftists, and laborers, felt excluded. Many of them had supported local people's committees that had sprung up after liberation, only to see them dismantled under American oversight. The suppression of left-wing movements, including the South Korean Workers' Party, led to strikes, protests, and violent uprisings. One of the most haunting of these was the Jeju Uprising, which began in April 1948, just weeks before the elections. On the island of Jeju, local rebels, angered by the division and the election's exclusion of the North, rose against police and government forces. The response from Seoul was brutal. Over the next year, tens of thousands of islanders were killed in what later became known as the Jeju Massacre, a dark prelude to the blood that would soon engulf all of Korea. Ri's government, meanwhile, began consolidating power through fear and control. Thousands of suspected communists were imprisoned. Political opponents were silenced. The U.S. military, anxious about the global advance of communism after the fall of China and the Berlin blockade, turned a blind eye to Ri's authoritarian methods. To Washington, he was unpleasant but necessary as a bulwark in Asia's ideological battlefield. In the North, the Soviets had moved more swiftly and effectively in establishing a unified political system. Kim Il-sung's leadership was solidified through purges of rival factions and the merging of socialist parties under his control. Land reform was completed, Japanese properties nationalized, and industry reorganized under state planning. Soviet advisors ensured that every institution, from education to the military, reflected socialist ideals. The North portrayed itself as a workers' paradise rising from the ruins, while the South was painted as a capitalist puppet state serving foreign masters. Both sides waged propaganda wars, broadcasting rival claims of legitimacy. Posters, radio speeches, and newspapers echoed the same theme. We are the true Korea. Internationally, the peninsula became a microcosm of the Cold War. The United States quickly recognized the Republic of Korea as the sole legal government. The Soviet Union responded in kind, recognizing the DPRK. What had once been a local issue, a nation's struggle for self-determination, was now absorbed into the global standoff between capitalism and communism. By late 1948, both Koreas had formed armies under the pretense of national defense. In reality, they were preparing for confrontation. The border at the 38th parallel turned tense, with frequent skirmishes and raids. American and Soviet officers withdrew their main occupation troops, but left behind advisors, weapons, and training missions. Each side accused the other of aggression. In Seoul, Ri proclaimed his readiness to march north and unify the peninsula under his government. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung urged his Soviet backers to approve a similar plan to liberate the South and drive out imperialist forces. Both men believed they were destined to complete Korea's unification, and both underestimated how devastating such ambitions could become. The line between North and South was no longer a mere demarcation. It had become a psychological frontier dividing families, separating brothers who had fought side by side against Japan, and turning neighbors into enemies. Letters stopped crossing the border. Trains halted at the 38th parallel. Entire villages were split between two worlds. The human cost of division deepened quietly. Farmers in the north lost contact with markets in the south. Southern students could no longer attend universities in Pyongyang, once a cultural center of the peninsula. Religious leaders, intellectuals, and activists were forced to choose sides. Thousands fled southward, fearing communist reprisals. Others went north, believing socialism offered a fairer future. By the end of 1948, the die was cast. Korea, once united under one dynasty for over 1,000 years, now exists as two nations, the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Each believed it was the only legitimate Korea. Each was preparing for the day when it would prove it through force. The world, watching from afar, treated this as another Cold War division like Germany or Vietnam. But for Koreans, it was personal. Every family knew someone on the other side. Every home bore the weight of separation. And as the snow fell over the 38th parallel that winter, soldiers on both sides waited, rifles in hand, staring into the darkness, not yet realizing that within 2 short years, they would be at war. The establishment of two rival governments in 1948 was not the natural evolution of Korean politics. It was the culmination of foreign agendas and ideological struggle that had turned Korea into a pawn of global rivalry. What began as a war of words, of speeches and proclamations, would soon erupt into one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. The 38th parallel, once drawn by chance, had now become a border of blood. The hope that independence would bring unity was gone. Instead, Korea entered a new era of confrontation, suspicion, and waiting. For in the heart of every Korean, North and South, one dream remained: to see their country whole again. But unity, once lost, is not easily regained. And by the end of 1948, the peninsula's fate was sealed. The division was now real, political, and irreversible, a creation of war and fear that neither side could undo. The border, once imagined, had become destiny. June 25, 1950, dawn broke quietly over the Korean peninsula. Farmers prepared their fields, children chased each other through the streets of Seoul, and soldiers stood watch along the uneasy line that cut the country in two. Then, at 4 a.m., the stillness shattered. North Korean artillery thundered across the 38th parallel. Tanks rolled south through the mist. Within hours, the Korean War, the first hot war of the Cold War, had begun. To the north, Kim Il-sung declared that his forces were launching a counterattack against southern provocations. To the south, President Syngman re-denounced a full-scale invasion by communist forces. In reality, there had been skirmishes and cross-border raids for months, but nothing of this magnitude. Now, the conflict that had been brewing since 1948 had exploded into open war. The North Korean People's Army, KPA, trained and equipped by the Soviet Union, swept forward with shocking speed. Soviet T-34 tanks led the charge, overwhelming the lightly armed South Korean defenders. Within 3 days, North Korean troops had captured Seoul. The South Korean army, disorganized, poorly supplied, and lacking air support, collapsed in retreat. Civilians fled in panic. Bridges were blown up to slow the advance, but it was too late. By the end of June, North Korean banners flew over the capital. For the United States, this was a nightmare realized. Just a year earlier, Mao Zedong's communist forces had taken China. Washington feared that the fall of Korea would complete a domino effect across Asia. U.S. President Harry S. Truman, without waiting for Congress, ordered American forces to intervene under the banner of the United Nations. On June 27, 1950, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 83, calling on member states to aid South Korea, a vote made possible only because the Soviet Union was boycotting the council at that moment. American air and naval power moved swiftly. U.S. bombers struck North Korean supply lines. Warships steamed toward the peninsula. But on the ground, the situation grew desperate. By July, South Korean and U.S. troops grouped under the command of General Douglas MacArthur were pushed into a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan. There, on the southeastern tip of the peninsula, they made a last stand. The Pusan perimeter became the hinge of history. Under relentless assault, the defenders held firm through summer heat and torrential rain. Supplies and reinforcements poured in from Japan. For 2 months, the world watched as one corner of Korea became the battleground between communism and the West. Over 140,000 UN troops from 16 nations would eventually fight in Korea, including British, Canadian, Australian, and Turkish forces. Then came a turning point. On September 15, 1950, General MacArthur launched one of the most daring amphibious operations in military history, the Incheon landing. At dawn, U.S. Marines stormed the heavily fortified port near Seoul, far behind enemy lines. The North Koreans, caught completely off guard, were surrounded. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was recaptured. The tide of war had turned. By early October, UN and South Korean forces had pushed beyond the 38th parallel, driving deep into North Korea. The momentum was intoxicating. Truman and MacArthur agreed that the mission was no longer just defense, it was reunification. They would destroy the North Korean regime and end the division once and for all. But that ambition carried a fatal flaw. As UN forces approached the Yalu River, the border with China, warnings from Beijing went unheeded. Mao Zedong had repeatedly declared that China would not tolerate hostile troops on its frontier. Washington dismissed it as a bluff. It was not. In late October 1950, as U.S. soldiers neared the Yalu, tens of thousands of Chinese troops from the People's Volunteer Army crossed the frozen river under the cover of night. They moved silently, wearing white camouflage, carrying supplies on their backs. When they struck, it was with devastating force. The Chinese counteroffensive transformed the war overnight. The UN forces, stretched thin and unprepared for winter conditions, were driven into a chaotic retreat. Entire units were encircled. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze in their foxholes. At the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, U.S. Marines fought their way out of encirclement in one of the most grueling withdrawals in modern warfare. By January 1951, the Chinese and North Koreans had retaken Seoul. For the second time, the South's capital fell. The dream of unification under the South vanished, replaced by desperation to survive. But the UN regrouped. Reinforced and re-equipped, they launched a counterattack that recaptured Seoul by March 1951. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel, the same line that had divided Korea since 1945. The war then descended into a stalemate. For the next 2 years, both sides fought bitterly for mere miles of territory. Battles like Heartbreak Ridge and Pork Chop Hill turned mountains into graveyards. Artillery thundered day and night. The U.S. Air Force launched relentless bombing campaigns, reducing North Korean cities to rubble. Pyongyang, Wonsan, and Hamhung were flattened. Villages vanished in firestorms. Civilian suffering was unimaginable. Millions fled their homes. Families were separated forever. Massacres occurred on both sides. The Bodo League killings in the south, purges and executions in the north. In the chaos of total war, ideology became justification for slaughter. As negotiations dragged on at Panmunjom, the peace table became another battlefield. The main obstacle was the issue of prisoners of war. Thousands of North Korean and Chinese captives refused repatriation, fearing execution if returned home. The talks stalled for months. Meanwhile, the global Cold War hardened around Korea. The U.S. reinforced its alliances in Asia, signing defense pacts with Japan and the Philippines. The Soviet Union expanded its military support to China and North Korea. The Korean War had transformed a regional conflict into a permanent geopolitical fault line. Finally, in April 1951, General MacArthur publicly called for expanding the war into China, even suggesting the use of atomic weapons. Truman, fearing a wider conflict, dismissed him, a decision that shocked Americans and revealed deep divisions within U.S. strategy. By 1952, the war had ground into a grim rhythm: attack, counterattack, negotiation, stalemate. Villages changed hands dozens of times. Entire generations of Koreans grew up amid ruin. For many soldiers, it became a war without meaning, fought not for victory, but for endurance. After 2 years of negotiation, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. The document, signed by U.S. General William K. Harrison for the UN Command and North Korean General Nam Il for the Korean People's Army, established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a 250-kilometer buffer strip roughly following the 38th parallel. No peace treaty was ever signed. The war ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. The cost was staggering. Over 3 million Korean civilians and soldiers were killed or wounded. Nearly every city in the north was destroyed. The south lay in ruins, its infrastructure shattered. Millions of families were permanently separated by the new border. To this day, many have never reunited. The Korean War also reshaped the world order. It cemented the Cold War's military blocs, NATO in the West, the Sino-Soviet alliance in the East. It legitimized the United Nations as a tool of U.S. foreign policy, yet also exposed its limits. For Asia, it marked the dawn of decades of militarization and suspicion. In Korea itself, the war created two states locked in permanent hostility. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung emerged from the ashes as a national hero. Despite catastrophic losses, he consolidated power, rebuilding the North under strict Soviet and Chinese supervision. His regime turned the devastation into propaganda proof of foreign aggression, a justification for absolute control. In the South, Syngman Rhee survived politically only through American support. His government became increasingly authoritarian, imprisoning dissidents and suppressing any leftist opposition under the banner of anti-communism. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides mourned devastation. The war had not solved the question that began in 1945: who would unite Korea? Instead, it froze the question in place, leaving the peninsula divided indefinitely. By the time the guns fell silent, the 38th parallel had become the most dangerous border on Earth. Barbed wire, minefields, and watchtowers scarred the landscape. The DMZ, ironically, became a strange sanctuary for wildlife, even as human beings were forbidden to cross it. And yet, beneath the politics and propaganda, the Korean people endured. In Seoul, the ruins slowly gave way to rebuilding. In Pyongyang, the state preached reconstruction and loyalty. But neither side could escape the shadow of 1950, the moment when ideology turned brother against brother, and the dream of unity became a nightmare of division. The Korean War was never officially declared, and it has never officially ended. Over 70 years later, the armistice still stands. Soldiers still patrol the same hills. Families still wait for word from the other side. It began as a civil conflict, became an international war, and ended as a frozen stalemate, but its consequences echo across generations. For the world, it was the first confrontation of the nuclear age, the first time that global powers clashed without crossing into total war. For Koreans, it was the moment destiny was rewritten. The war that was meant to reunite Korea instead made its division permanent. A line drawn hastily in 1945 became soaked in blood by 1953. And though the battles ended, the war in every sense never truly did. The guns fell silent in July 1953, but the Korean Peninsula never truly found peace. The armistice that ended the fighting did not end the war, it merely froze it in place. Between two ruined nations, a narrow strip of land was drawn across mountains and rivers, the Korean Demilitarized Zone, 2.5 miles wide and 250 kilometers long. Behind its barbed wire fences, landmines, and guard posts, the world's most heavily fortified border took shape. Soldiers stood watch, face to face, guns loaded, eyes fixed across a frontier that neither side could cross. It was a wound in the heart of Asia that would never heal. For the next 4 decades, Korea became the sharpest edge of the Cold War. The armistice divided not just territory, but entire worlds of belief. In the North, Kim Il-sung emerged from the wreckage as the unchallenged leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He had survived invasion, bombardment, and near defeat. Now, he would rebuild the North as a state of total control, forged through ideology and fear. The ruins of Pyongyang rose again, rebuilt with Soviet and Chinese aid. Factories were constructed from the rubble. New apartment blocks and grand monuments appeared across the capital. The war became the foundation of a national mythology of North Korea as a sacred land besieged by imperialists, saved only by the courage of its leader. Kim Il-sung's image appeared everywhere, his name sung in schools and broadcast over loudspeakers. He was no longer merely a revolutionary. He was the embodiment of the nation itself. To sustain this myth, Kim introduced an ideology that would define North Korea for generations: Juche, or self-reliance. It was a doctrine that promised independence from all foreign influence, economic, political, and cultural. On paper, it offered dignity to a small nation trapped between great powers. In practice, it became a mechanism for isolation, ensuring that loyalty to the leader would replace all other values. By the late 1950s, Kim Il-sung had consolidated total power. Rivals who had fought alongside him during the anti-Japanese struggle were purged. Soviet-trained officers, Chinese-backed commanders, and early communists who questioned his authority vanished in waves of executions and exile. North Korea became a one-man state. Every achievement was credited to Kim's genius, every disaster blamed on enemies within. The war's devastation became a lesson. Only unity under one leader could protect the Korean people. Across the border, the South followed a different path, but one no less shaped by war. Seoul was a city of ruins in 1953. Millions were homeless, and the economy was shattered. Yet beneath the ashes, a new order began to form. The Republic of Korea, under President Syngman Rhee, became a key ally of the United States. American troops remained on the peninsula, their presence transforming South Korea into a fortress of capitalism on Asia's front line. Billions in U.S. aid poured in, rebuilding roads, factories, and schools. But the promise of democracy that had accompanied liberation quickly faded. Rhee ruled with an iron hand, suppressing dissent, imprisoning opponents, and manipulating elections. His anti-communism was absolute. To challenge his authority was to risk being branded a traitor. By the 1960s, both Koreas had hardened into mirror images of each other, two dictatorships, each claiming legitimacy as the true Korea. Both regimes taught their citizens that unification could come only through the destruction of the other. In the North, propaganda painted the South as a colony of American imperialism. Children were taught to hate and to prepare for war. Massive rallies praised the great leader, whose portrait hung in every home. The state controlled every aspect of life, where people lived, what they studied, and even what songs they sang. Surveillance became routine. Fear became loyalty. In the South, the government preached vigilance against communist infiltration. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency, modeled after the CIA, monitored political activists and censored the press. Students and intellectuals who questioned authority were arrested or disappeared. The Cold War had divided the world, but in Korea, it divided hearts and minds. Then came 1960, a year of reckoning. In Seoul, growing frustration with Rhee's corruption and electoral fraud erupted into the April Revolution. Students flooded the streets, demanding his resignation. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. By the end of the month, Syngman Rhee fled the country, exiled to Hawaii. For the first time since independence, South Koreans had brought down a dictator with their own hands. But the victory was short-lived. A year later, a military coup swept aside the fragile democracy. The new leader was General Park Chung-hee, a former officer in the Japanese army who now promised order, stability, and development. Under Park, South Korea became a militarized state, but one with a vision. Park launched a series of 5-year economic plans, modeled after Japan's rapid industrialization. Highways and factories spread across the peninsula. Export industries were encouraged. The government forged alliances with powerful family-run conglomerates, the Chaebols, names like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG that would later become global giants. By the late 1970s, South Korea's economy was booming. The world began to speak of a miracle on the Han River. Yet the miracle had a cost. Political repression deepened. Martial law silenced dissent. Student movements were crushed with violence. In 1979, Park's own intelligence chief assassinated him at a dinner meeting, an act born of exhaustion and disillusionment with authoritarian rule. Meanwhile, across the border, North Korea seemed frozen in time. The economy initially recovered well in the 1950s and 1960s, benefiting from Soviet and Chinese support. Industrial production soared, and Pyongyang's infrastructure outpaced that of Seoul for a brief period. But by the 1970s, cracks began to appear. Isolation, inefficiency, and the burden of maintaining a massive military drained the nation's resources. Kim Il-sung responded with grandeur. The capital was rebuilt again, now as a city of marble monuments and colossal statues. In 1972, a new constitution formalized his position as president for life. The cult of personality intensified, extending even to his family. His son, Kim Jong-il, began his ascent as the heir apparent, ensuring that power would remain dynastic, an unprecedented move in communist history. The two Koreas continued to glare across the DMZ. Armed incidents were frequent: infiltrations, assassinations, even hijackings. In 1968, North Korean commandos attempted to assassinate President Park in Seoul. The following year, they shot down a U.S. spy plane, killing 31 crewmen. Each act deepened the hostility, yet both sides occasionally reached for peace. In 1972, secret negotiations produced the North-South Joint Communique, the first formal agreement since the war. It spoke of peaceful reunification, mutual respect, and dialogue. But within months, it collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust. By the 1980s, the global Cold War was changing. China began to open to the world under Deng Xiaoping. The Soviet Union weakened under economic strain. But in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung clung to his isolation. North Korea refused reform, rejecting both Moscow's perestroika and Beijing's capitalism. The regime turned inward, building tunnels under the DMZ and expanding its military to nearly 1 million men. In the South, change finally came from the streets. After decades of struggle, a massive wave of protests in 1987 forced the military to concede democratic reforms. Free elections followed, ushering in a new era of civilian rule. For the first time in modern history, South Korea began to resemble the democracy its founders had once promised. The contrast between the two Koreas grew stark. Seoul became a symbol of modernization, hosting the 1988 Olympic Games, joining the ranks of advanced industrial nations. Pyongyang remained a city of slogans and scarcity. The end of the Cold War in 1991 transformed the world, but not Korea's division. The collapse of the Soviet Union cut off North Korea's most vital source of aid. Famine followed. Kim Il-sung, aging and frail, clung to power, preparing his son to inherit a starving state. In the South, the economy surged forward, transforming into a high-tech powerhouse. When both Koreas joined the United Nations in 1991, it marked a strange kind of recognition. The world now accepted that there were, in practice, two Koreas. The dream of reunification receded further into symbolism and memory. By the time Kim Il-sung died in 1994, the Cold War was over everywhere except here. The border remained sealed, the armies still faced each other, and the ideology that had divided a people still defined their lives. For the rest of the world, the Korean Peninsula became a relic of the 20th century, a frozen battlefield, an unfinished story. But for Koreans, it remained a living reality. The Cold War may have ended in Berlin and Moscow, but on the banks of the Imjin River and the hills of the DMZ, it never truly stopped. From 1953 to 1991, the Korean Peninsula lived in a state of suspended war, a generation born into division, growing old under flags that told opposite versions of the same history. And through it all, the line drawn in 1945 endured. It had been meant as a temporary boundary of surrender. Instead, it became a permanent border between two worlds, one open, modern, and democratic, the other closed, militarized, and absolute. The Cold War legacy left more than a political divide. It left two nations whose identities were built around that divide. One saw its future in global cooperation, the other in eternal resistance. And in that difference, the shadow of 1948 lingered long after the rest of the world had moved on. 75 years have passed since the Korean Peninsula was torn into two nations, yet the line drawn in 1945 still cuts through hills, rivers, and rice paddies guarded by soldiers who stare across barbed wire at faces that are in truth their own. Today, the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, is one of the most heavily fortified borders in human history, a strip of land where the echoes of past conflicts are felt in every step, every patrol, every whispered order. It is a place where time seems to have stopped, where the aspirations of a unified Korea have been replaced by the weight of division, and where the ghosts of 1948 continue to shape reality. The story of Korea's separation is not simply a tale of two countries. It is a story of one people caught between the ambitions of empires, the currents of ideology, and the consequences of decisions made far beyond their own borders. It is a story that began in the ruins of the Japanese Empire in August 1945, when ordinary Koreans poured into the streets with flags hastily sewn from scraps, celebrating liberation after 35 years of occupation. They had expected freedom, self-determination, and the restoration of their homeland. Instead, they found themselves divided by a line drawn on a map, by foreign officers with little knowledge of the land they divided. That line, the 38th parallel, would become far more than a simple demarcation. It became a psychological barrier separating families and friends, and an ideological boundary dividing capitalism from communism, democracy from dictatorship. The division was formalized in 1948 with the creation of two governments, the Republic of Korea in the south, under Syngman Rhee, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, under Kim Il-sung. Each claimed to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Each was prepared for confrontation. And in the process, ordinary Koreans became spectators to their own fate, caught between the forces of history they could not control. The years that followed solidified the separation. In 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, triggering the Korean War, the first major armed conflict of the Cold War. Over 3 years, the peninsula became a battlefield, cities were destroyed, and millions of civilians died. The Armistice Agreement of 1953 ended active hostilities, but never produced a peace treaty. The border hardened into the DMZ, a tangible scar that continues to separate the North from the South. For the people of Korea, the division was no longer temporary. It was permanent, entrenched in law, in ideology, and in everyday life. Over the decades, the differences between the two Koreas became stark. In the North, Kim Il-sung consolidated power, creating a dynastic dictatorship and promoting the ideology of Juche, self-reliance, as a guiding principle of society. Education, media, and culture were mobilized to glorify the state and the leader, cultivating a society in which loyalty was inseparable from survival. In the South, despite authoritarian rule under Syngman Rhee and later Park Chung-hee, the nation gradually embraced economic development and political reform. South Korea transformed from a war-torn, impoverished state into a democratic, industrial powerhouse. Yet the division was not only political and economic, it was profoundly human. Families were split, unable to see each other for decades. Brothers, sisters, and parents lived on opposite sides of a border that was not of their choosing. Letters, photos, and memories became their only links to one another. Some families waited in hope for reunification that would never come. Others succumbed to despair, accepting separation as fate. The human cost of the division, silent and enduring, is perhaps the most poignant legacy of 1948. Modern summits and diplomatic gestures, however, reveal the enduring desire for reconciliation. Occasional meetings between leaders, joint cultural events, and family reunions across the DMZ hint at a shared past and a potential future. Yet each handshake is haunted by history, the unresolved conflicts of 1948, the wars that followed, and the persistent ideological divides that remain entrenched in governance, society, and national identity. Every diplomatic breakthrough is fragile, subject to the fluctuations of politics, military posturing, and global alliances. The division of Korea is a testament to the power of foreign influence in shaping the destinies of nations. From the decisions of American and Soviet officers in 1945 to the strategic calculations of superpowers during the Cold War, Korea's separation was not merely a local event, but part of a global struggle. The world's powers treated the peninsula as a chessboard, moving troops and manipulating politics to suit larger ideological battles. For the Korean people, these decisions had immediate and lasting consequences, shaping their lives, their governments, and their understanding of nationhood. Yet history also shows resilience. Despite decades of separation, Koreans on both sides share a common language, culture, and history. Art, music, and literature continue to reflect shared traditions, even as each state promotes its own interpretation of the past. The memory of a unified Korea endures in collective consciousness, manifesting in subtle ways. In folklore, in cuisine, in the longing for reunification expressed by citizens in both the North and the South. The DMZ, ironically, has become both a symbol of division and a unique preservation zone. Wildlife flourishes where humans are absent. Rare species of birds, plants, and animals inhabit the no-man's land that stretches across the peninsula, untouched for decades. This unexpected outcome is a reminder that while politics can divide, nature persists in its own rhythm, indifferent to borders. For historians, the story of Korea's split offers lessons about the fragility of sovereignty and the consequences of geopolitical decisions. The division demonstrates how local aspirations can be overpowered by global strategy, how ideology can cement separation, and how the scars of war endure long after the last shot is fired. It is a story that continues to inform contemporary debates about foreign intervention, national identity, and reconciliation. The legacy of 1948 remains visible in everyday life. South Korean schools teach a history that emphasizes resistance to communism and the miraculous recovery of the nation, while North Korean education glorifies Kim Il-sung's leadership and the victories of the revolutionary struggle. Both narratives are rooted in the division, shaping generations' understanding of themselves and the other Korea. Technologically, economically, and socially, the divergence is stark. South Korea now leads in technology, pop culture, and global trade. North Korea, by contrast, has become isolated, maintaining strict control over information and society. Yet despite these differences, both societies share an unspoken awareness of the other's existence. North Koreans are aware of the South's prosperity, while South Koreans remember the North as home to millions of kinfolk and a shared history. In contemporary geopolitics, the peninsula remains central to regional and global concerns. Nuclear programs, missile tests, diplomatic summits, and military exercises continue to draw international attention. Korea's division is no longer a local concern, but a focal point of international security, a legacy of the ideological battles that began with liberation, occupation, and the establishment of two governments in 1948. The story of Korea's split is also a story of endurance. Ordinary Koreans, in both the North and the South, have adapted, survived, and persevered. They have witnessed war, dictatorship, famine, and isolation. Yet culture, memory, and hope persist. The longing for reunification, even if distant, remains a defining aspect of Korean identity. Every bridge that stretches across the Imjin River, Every village that looks toward the border, every soldier who patrols the DMZ carries with them the weight of history. The division that began as a map drawn by foreign powers in 1945 formalized into two governments in 1948 and solidified through war in the early 1950s, continues to shape life on the peninsula. It is a reminder that borders are not just lines on a map. They are lived experiences enforced by armies, ideology, and memory. As the world watches and debates, the human dimension remains. Children born today in Seoul or Pyongyang grow up with stories of separation, taught the narratives of two nations, yet connected by the same language and traditions. Elders recount tales of families torn apart, of a time when Korea was one. Every anniversary of liberation or armistice evokes not celebration alone, but reflection, mourning, and cautious hope. In the end, the history of Korea's division is a lesson in complexity. It is neither solely about ideology nor foreign interference, nor purely about local politics. It is about all of these forces intersecting at a specific time and place. It is about people whose destiny was reshaped by decisions made in distant capitals, by maps drawn overnight, by superpowers wrestling for influence. And it is about the enduring human spirit, the capacity to endure, adapt, and continue despite imposed separation. For the Korean people, history remains unfinished. Borders may exist, governments may change, and ideologies may clash, but the sense of shared identity cannot be erased. A nation divided in 1948 carries within it the memory of unity, a culture that transcends politics, and a hope that, someday, the peninsula might again be whole. The 38th parallel, the DMZ, the rival governments, and the histories they propagate are all monuments to the choices and missteps of 1945 to 1948. They are also reminders of what is possible when ordinary people are caught between the ambitions of empires. 75 years later, the story of why Korea split into North and South Korea remains not just a tale of division, but a living, breathing history that continues to unfold, shaping lives' decisions and the course of a nation, yet incomplete. And so, when one looks across the demilitarized hills, sees the patrols, and contemplates the families separated by decades, one must remember, the division that began not on the battlefield, but on a map, has endured far longer than anyone imagined. It has left a legacy of caution, resilience, and unbroken identity, and it stands as a testament to the power of history, geography, and human endurance in shaping the destiny of nations. The line drawn in 1945 became a border in 1948. That border, guarded by soldiers and cemented by war, became a living reality for generations. And for the people of Korea, it remains, to this day, both a scar and a reminder that history is not only written by leaders and maps, but by the lives of those who live through its consequences.